So hello everyone, welcome to our last general body meeting. Crazy how, the semester's almost over, wild. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple announcements before we get started. I'm Samantha Perez, Director of Middle School Outreach. I'm a third year CS student. Some of my hobbies include skating, volunteer, going to the beach, adventures. Right now, my favorite music genres are dubstep, darkwave, and indie rock.
Hi guys, I'm Lily Nguyen. I'm the ambassador. I'm a fourth year chemical. I'm a fourth year chemical engineering major. My hobbies include working out, traveling. I recently learned how to do my own nails through quarantine. And then also I really like to learn how to invest my money into different things. My music interests are hip hop, rap, and R&B. And there's just a few pictures there that kind of describe my life. So all right, so first announcement is that we have a scholarship opportunity. Pretty much you just obtain ticket. It's a ticket system, and so every time you go to a general body meeting or any of our events and fundraisers hosted by us, you will receive points. There are the requirements listed there. You must be a paid member of Maya's, and you must have a 2.5 GPA to enroll. But there will be 3 winners, and they will be announced at the end of the semester, I believe.
We just want to say thank you again for everyone who participated in the Krispy Kreme fundraiser. I hope you guys enjoyed those donuts just as much as I did. All of our funds will be going towards the scholarship, so yeah. Next thing on our agenda is that we do have, this is for freshmen, so Excel Learning Community. So as you're familiar, we've been contacted that you guys now have the opportunity to enroll into the Excel SI classes, which is really good because you get provided with a mentor and a whole bunch of other different opportunities, and you can also choose what type of what goes best with your schedule. Right here, section 05, 06, all that. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and email a HSI STEM. So yeah. I do want to give a little update about our website. We are having technical difficulties. So if you guys have any form of payments that you need to do, feel free to contact Myra right there. So if you guys want to save her email or just take a quick screenshot of that as well. And then we also have upcoming event is the time management workshop that I really encourage you guys to go to because so it is on Wednesday, December 2nd from 4 to 5 with Helen. So that should be exciting. And then Lily.
All right, so we do have some positions available, officer positions. So if you guys are interested, then you can definitely use a QR code there. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to any one of us, and we will definitely help you out if you have any specific questions.
And then don't forget to follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook. And if you guys want to take a quick picture, go right ahead as well. I'll give you guys some time. Okay, next slide. Also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact us. We'll respond ASAP. So info@CSULBMyas.org. And then for our special guest today, we have Philip Thompson talking about life as a cannabis extraction engineer. We'll pass it on over to Philip.
Hi. Well, gosh, I was gonna have a lot of slides, and I wanted to show all my PIDs and PFDs, but I just have been slammed lately because since I was notified about this, I've changed jobs, and it's just been really, really what this is about. So, I mean, where I lack in one area, I can make up in another. So still, I've got 4 steps to this, and I really want to step through each of them. The first one is cannabis extraction science. I think I did a presentation a while ago, and I felt like I didn't really talk about this much. So I really want to start there. I think when I was doing chemie, Dr. Mendez during separation processes asked me to do some cannabis extractions, and in a lot of ways, that's what got me started down this path, because my classmates in the group project insisted that we limit ourselves to what we had discussed from the class and not try to bring in any additional processes or ideas or engineering principles. So what we did was we came up with you add a solvent to your biomass, maybe you pre-treat it in order to have it react better with that solvent, and we used ethanol. One of the interesting things to consider here is we were very new, and we were trying to apply basic science that things that are hotter have higher solubility. So it was neat that we were able to simply apply heat using something like, I don't know if you're familiar with Soxhlet extractors, but you've got a condenser and then you've got a boiling flask, and you put your biomass in the middle, and it's got a siphon tube. So once it reaches a certain height, it'll flush the whole thing out. And stuff like that is interesting because it runs continuously. I mean, it's a batch process, but you just apply steady heat and cooling, and then it just runs until it's done. So a process like that can achieve total extraction. It can recover everything out. And, if you know that, it's something you can take for granted. So I'm just explaining that was where we started, just being some engineering students, thinking about, what are the basics that are in place. And then, the important part was actually distilling out the THC. I'll tell you that back in college, we didn't do a very good job of this. We probably converted it all into something else. But the fact that we're able to get anything in that molecular weight to separate and be in the vapor phase was quite an accomplishment, because, at industry, we have to use a lot of vacuums in order to do it. And back there, again, we were just applying engineering principles from class. So in this case, I don't know if any of you've done the tank draining experiment, but it was an adaptation of the fact that the longer the tube is, the more drag it has, and therefore the greater pressure drop. And so I just made like a really, really long tube, and technically we were doing something kind of like steam distillation where it draws moisture in. But by having a bunch of different locations on it, we were able to go from one step to another step to another step. And that's really what defined the refinement. So it was very silly, it was just, we grabbed a bunch of random stuff out of class, and we said, okay, that's a set of material that's available to us, let's just call it a project. But lo and behold, that is the most common way to process this stuff at industry today. So I just find it so interesting that it seems like, there is a better way to do things than what we're learning. But if you're very hardcore about applying what you know, the truth is the fundamentals are all you really need. So that's just the intro. That's where it began. I mean, cannabis extraction science really isn't about using alcohol that's hot in order to extract something that you can purify. I mean, really, botanical extraction deals with the business of there are many ways to accomplish the same goal. Since it's a startup industry, I've had to spend a lot of time looking for mentorship in other industries and then try to reapply it into what we're doing. That might be a clever thing to do, but if you compare it to the career path you have in other industries, it's like kind of unnecessary. If you just have the proper role models, you have, one place to go to figure everything out. But I guess because they didn't exist, we've gotten into the habit of innovating all the time. As a matter of fact, many of the people that I have to learn from have no engineering background, and they probably didn't really discover anything either. They have just been worldly, and they've been exposed to some ideas. So it took me a long time to get through this, but we started off doing something, just a liquid solvent, just understanding its thermodynamic properties. Then when I went to industry, we're basically doing CO2 extraction. So if you want to understand how that works, it's basically high pressure extraction. You know, people like to use CO2 because if you compare it to something like nitrogen, it does have solubility. But otherwise, the whole point is that it's a solvent you can get up to like 4,000 psi, and you know it'll do something. It's the pressure. We are squishing out the contents of the soil. So, you know, if you're an engineer, then you can understand like we need 20 cycles of CO2 per the amount of biomass that's in there in order to get our extraction out. So then we have instruments, you know, we're measuring the flow rate, and you're trying to consider the flow rate of the CO2 versus the amount that's in there. And then, you know, you can understand that it ends up in the collection side. This is the convention. Now, I can tell you that the time I've spent with CO2 has told a different story. As a matter of fact, really what tends to limit these processes is that you have viscosity from the cannabis extract, and it has more of a capillary effect. So when the tubes are too small, like let's say 1/8 of an inch inner diameter, or even 1/4 of an inch inner diameter, it doesn't move very fast. So despite the theory on how much solvent's needed to extract something, you have a different limitation on it actually moving through the system to the place you're going to collect it in. It's interesting. You know, you can take the biomass out, and then you can measure it in different places. And even though you're measuring the composition, what you're discovering is kind of visually how far did it get. I mean, there's like 20% on top that just it couldn't fit through the tube, and then that ends up being a process limitation. That's not intuitive. You know, being able to figure out when it's one thing or another thing is more than understanding the engineering, but it's trying to figure out what's relevant and what's actually affecting you, and then having to deal with the fact that all these other people you're working with aren't quite thinking that way. Maybe they're not even going to understand the way it's being explained, no matter how carefully you present it and build up the ideas and demonstrate it and find evidence. So that was CO2 extraction. I mean, I'll tell you, when I look at the way bigger companies like GW Pharmaceutical, which is one of the biggest cannabis companies in the world, operates, I think they don't even do CO2 extraction the way everyone does it with a supercritical fluid. I believe that they actually use a liquid, and then they just sort of flush it along, and this liquid has a very powerful solubilizing effect. But that's where I'm beginning to get into another aspect of it, which is the difference between hot extraction and cold extraction. You know, a lot of people don't see why you would want to use a cold solvent if you're trying to achieve high throughput and get good yields. But the truth is that we have to expend an enormous amount of energy to refine the extract after it's already been collected. So, you know, obviously, if you can avoid the need for that excess energy by expending a little bit extra earlier on, then it's going to be a savings, and it could even be a quality improvement, which is what we observed. You see, a colder solvent is more selective, therefore it's going to leave more things behind. And we know that what we're after has greater affinity for these solvents. So it actually serves our interest to try to avoid co-extracting the undesirable components of our biomass. Then that opens up a new question of what is the right temperature? You know, what is optimum in this sense? You know, it's kind of a big global measurement. And of course, that gets back into the business of how do we actually measure anything, and how do we know anything about our process? I'm just kind of rattling off some stuff about the extraction science, but because I want to build up to where the industry really, really thrives, there's a different kind of extraction that's using hydrocarbon gases that have this flammability component to them. And for years, there's been a lot of fear that there's no way you can do that safely. But now we're finding that actually, there's no way you can make the kind of products that you make using that technique, using any other process solvent. And now that changes things, you know, that just flips the table around. I got to tell you, it has been so interesting doing something called live resin hydrocarbon extraction. See, what we're really doing then is a lot of people use hydrocarbons and they go hot, and then you've got the vapors moving around, and it's extraordinarily dangerous. The issue with live resin doesn't actually deal with the extraction, but the preparation of the material. So just to back it up a little bit, the process, which I apologize for not illustrating, it involves taking the biomass, it grows, you cut it, you generally dry it out, and then there's a thing about gently getting the moisture out, and then you end up with something that has a lot of fragrance. But in live resin, we don't do that. I'll tell you that the drying process is generally where everything goes wrong with the flower. It's the greatest vulnerable point in the whole process. But in live resin, we freeze it immediately after harvest. Just last year, I was working at a facility where we had a large liquid nitrogen batch chiller. We would cut the plants, and within a few hours, we throw them under liquid nitrogen. Then we would bag them and put them in a freezer at -20 Fahrenheit. Then inside that freezer, we'd bring these columns, and we would pack the columns with that flower inside the -20 Fahrenheit freezer. It was such a challenge to do this. It sucks the moisture out of your lungs. Within 10 minutes, you can't even be in the room. I had to have our technicians wearing something from hunting. It's like an active heated vest, so it actually is keeping a set point temperature on our operators just to give them an extra 5 minutes before they would need to, retire from the room anyway. And yet we were still able to achieve our goals. It was very interesting what happened here, because we're taking the columns at this low temperature and then we rush them into an explosion-proof room where there can be, no sparks of any kind. And we have all of this incredible HVAC on a closed circuit just to push these, dangerous vapors out of the building, whether or not they're there. We put it up on a machine where all of the, the chillers and other things, they're kept in a separate room so that we don't have to worry about that vapor exposure. And then, we try to hug it up against the wall so that we can shorten the distances and avoid temperature drop. We have the solvent being kept at -90 Celsius. And then the way it flows over to our extraction column is by putting nitrogen pressure behind it. So this is what's really interesting. I told you earlier, CO2 extraction is done about 4,000 PSI. Hydrocarbon extraction is done at under 100 PSI. As a matter of fact, most of these pieces of equipment will just rupture, the seals just pop off as soon as you get to 200 PSI. They just don't hold pressure beyond that. And I think that can be a little tricky when you know that we're working with a dangerous flammable gas. But the fact of the matter is, when that chemical is at -90 Celsius, whether it's butane or propane or a variety of these other hydrocarbons, it has no vapor pressure. So it's not actually what's leaking out of the vessel. That's the nitrogen that we were using to push it around. It is so interesting when you think about it that way. If we had these hydrocarbon extractors rated to 4,000 PSI, you wouldn't see anything exiting the system until it was 4,000 PSI, at which point it would probably just be, spontaneously combust, creating really greater hazards at a higher risk. In that way, it's very non-intuitive, but if you're working with it and you understand the science behind it, it actually makes a lot of sense. So with this hydrocarbon system, it goes from the column where it mixes up and becomes what we call a micella. And then we would push it again with the nitrogen. Maybe we'd push it through a dewaxing column where we're exposing it to absorbents, but preferably we don't. It goes into a column at 40 Celsius, and all of a sudden, all of those vapors are just ripped out. They go out through another chamber to our condenser due to the natural static equilibrium. But if that weren't enough, what's very common is you get these gas compressors that are rated for what's called C1D1 or explosion proof. And you can turn them on. There are electronics existing in this explosive environment that are rated for it. And it rips everything through very quickly. Then we would pass it through 2 chillers. One of them's, in the industry, they call it a shotgun condenser, but really it's a shell and tube heat exchanger. So that system, we try to have it also at -20, but it doesn't really matter because the point is that it's taking all of that energy, and it's just bringing it down to like a controlled point where now the vapor pressures are low again, and the safety is kind of like back, the hazards have been minimized. Then we pass it back to that original solvent tank that's going to drive down to -90 Celsius. That's the closed loop. It's interesting. See, the solvent comes out of that hot column through a needle valve in the bottom. That could be connected to another vessel, so it doesn't need to be another vapor exposure. However, it is very interesting how you assemble those systems, because that could be tied back into your closed loop as well, at which point flammable vapors would never even enter the workplace unless something was going wrong. So it has been very interesting to try to develop these safety programs because it involves all of the tools in chemical engineering. I could get into greater detail about that, but let's try and come back to that later, because I've got a few other topics that I think are a little bit more meaningful here. So I want to talk about process design and consultation, because, you know, we're learning engineering. We're learning how to design processes. So, you know, you might want to go out and be a process designer. I mean, if you don't, you go out into the workplace and you're seeing processes, and you know, what if they're not that efficient? You know, what if they're not that well designed? You know, and now you're being forced to do some kind of process that, you know, it doesn't really reflect the intelligence that you have. It's a very interesting problem. You know, something I find myself talking about a lot is the quickness, the swiftness that intelligence responds to facts. You know, you can't blame yourself for not knowing something up until the point that it's been presented to you. However, at that point in time, you know, a smarter person is going to recognize, you know, the value of that information and incorporate it into how they're looking at the problem, into their perspective. It's really crazy to sort of look back a few years and think about how you were solving problems, and to see how you don't do it that way anymore. You don't think about that, because once you're learning a better way of getting the job done, you know that's the right way. So it is so frustrating when you're not able to provide that consultation to your own team, that they just decide, you know, you don't have that, because what do you do about it? Yeah, honestly, working in cannabis, no one's sitting around thinking, you know, who among us is the best process engineer? It's a fray. You know, I'm dealing with tons of people that don't have an engineering background that just say, well, you know, I know how I like things done, or I've seen it done a good way. The thing is that without the background, without like a firm understanding of how you're thinking, how you're making decisions, it's pretty much just, you know, trading little tools, you know, trading little pieces of information. So it's just interesting. I've had to hire a lot of chemical engineering graduates and other kinds of engineering graduates, and we talk about this, how, you know, we're able to have a conversation about what the process is and how it could be different. But we can't have that conversation with so many other of our colleagues. You know, even if they think they get stuff, they really don't have the mechanical understanding of all these pieces and interactions. So what I found is you've got to basically say, you know, as you hit the workforce, like, I have these abilities, and there's all these other people out in the workforce. They don't really have those abilities, but that doesn't mean that I'm better at the job than them. You know, what it really means is that there's so much more that it takes to round yourself out. You know, I look at it this way, you know, by the time I can do what they can do, I'm going to be able to do more than they can do, because I've got these other facilities behind me. And it's kind of a tough lesson, but if you work through that, everyone else responds to that. You know, when they see that you're dealing with the same challenges that they're dealing with in the same way that they're dealing with them, they're more likely to think that you have a greater ability to think in ways that they don't. And that's where consultation comes into effect. It's effectively like saying, you know, these people that do things, you think it's not a good way to do it. You understand why they think that way, and then you can get their job, and then you can do it better and continue to progress. So the thing about process design is it tends to happen as a consultation. It tends to happen outside of your job, even if it's related to your job. And to that extent, it tends to be a project. Something that I've had to deal with in cannabis is the difference between a project and an operation. There's a really neat certificate. I know a lot of people go from engineering and then they get like a business master's or something. But honestly, if you get something like a project management professional certificate, it's kind of good enough. I mean, consider what I'm saying. You finished engineering, you know math, you know science, you know learning things, you understand how to make connections that way. You don't really need to go learn that again, especially not, you know, on like a lower level. I mean, all you really are missing is the lingo, you know, the exact culture of thought relating to how we're organizing these specific business objectives. And you can get all of that for like a couple $100. I mean, it's such a better deal than going to get like a whole master's degree for it, especially when you can still do that. Furthermore, if you're doing that, people are showing, or people recognize that you're showing initiative, that you're, again, developing the same kind of things that are within their reach, but then surpassing it. So at that point, I kind of want to transition over to talking about plant construction and commissioning, because I find that when I'm talking to people that are also trying to get into the industry, or really just trying to progress in any industry, there's this concept that like, I need to freelance, I need to be able to get gigs, get jobs. But I have a strong feeling that it doesn't mean what you think it means when people are saying that. Really, no one's going onto these freelance gig websites to find someone that's going to organize their multi-million-dollar project. That's just not what that is. Really, those are the little pieces of the project. So this is a term I'm trying to bring up called commissioning. The concept that someone's asking you to go take care of a really big project for them and to do it in a particular way. To be a little more clear, an operation has no end date. A project has an end date, and therefore they structure their contents a little bit differently. An operation, you're planning to continue things indefinitely. So you have a way of looking at what you're doing as though everyone's a permanent stakeholder. And then we try to make up for our inability to actually be permanent in anything. Now, in a project, it's quite different. Effectively, everything is going to end at a certain point. So everything is temporary. Everything has a date that it'll be over by. And if that's not the correct date, then we keep adjusting it. Additionally, there's the money aspect. So, right between these two things is the fact that we have to make changes over time. So sometimes this is called continuing improvement. The idea is that an operation needs to think about what they're not thinking about, and they need to set aside money in their budget in order to account for, we can't really account for like a couple $1,000s worth of little things that happen. We want to get those pieces as we need them. And, if we can think of a more creative way to tackle it and actually resolve that, then that's the budget for it. See, what happens is people try to do all of their projects within that budget. And that's not it. If you actually have a really clear idea of like a large change you're trying to make, and you try to fund that within your continuous improvement budget, you're not going to have any money left over for all those little things that are really what comprise continuous improvement. Big projects, things you can actually identify, need to have specific resources set apart for them in order to go accomplish those things. And it's got to be appropriate. And that's where it comes down to commissioning, because if you can actually go to the people with those resources and explain the relationship between them spending those resources and getting some particular kind of result, you're not a freelancer. You're the one that conceived of the whole project from the beginning. That's very different with commissioning. That is just such a better way of going about things, because that puts you in control. And that's really going to demonstrate your abilities to creatively solve problems, because you start on the drawing board and then you literally end up with probably some kind of operation that's going to go indefinitely, and it'll probably have a lot of people that are going to be employed by it and work on it. And yet technically the project manager, the one that was commissioned to do it, isn't really a part of that team. That's what makes it a very unique skill set. It's something we tend to talk about when we're doing our senior project designs, things like that. However, talking personally, that's not everything. Why do you want to go out and get a job that ends? Is probably the next question. Like, I want a job that doesn't end. I want to have something that I can build a life around, actually have a livelihood. So that's why I like talking about operations management and really workplace leadership, because most of the people that I've met out there that have an ability for process design, and certainly those that are getting commissions, they tend to never hang around long enough to actually manage the operation. They never really build the relationships with the team, with the product, with the community that are effectively the stakeholders in, what is something that can sustain you throughout your whole career. So I really like talking about operations management. And I think this has really been my strength, is showing how we can do something like cannabis extraction, which really has no established rhythm to it, and then create something that we're going to do every day. So, to get back to what I was talking about at the beginning, I've got this factory here. I just came into about a week ago, and we have products we make, and we have a workflow, and we've got teams dedicated to different areas. But ever since the company I'm working for acquired it, we've been going through a lot of the data, and we're determining that there's not the efficiencies that we're looking for. So it's kind of interesting how, not as a consultant, or some kind of commissioner, but really as the manager coming in and transitioning from one way of doing work to another. It's not so much about having a penchant for changing things, but rather having a clear idea of what is the proper way of getting it done. Now, that's something that's somewhat ubiquitous from one industry to another. That's something that has high transferability. And that is effectively why it leads, to a career progression. In some ways, it's got very little to do with what the operation is itself, what the product is itself. This is about a very, routine, very, disciplined way of arriving at those solutions. That way, we're able to collaborate, and take on ideas from other people, receive the ideas from the process designers that I guess are more committed to it, and being able to work with them and say, hey, I like to design processes, and I can tell that you're doing it something better. I want my people to be able to train on that. So I really want to talk about this. I've managed to get a lot of jobs by simply doing something like this. I see a job listing, I see what they're looking for in the person, but then I see a company, and so here's a company, it's making a product. I can tell what that product is. I'll literally sketch out the entire operation and then develop the quality assurance system for that operation, describing how I would actually train the entire staff in order to make the product more efficiently, and just walk up to the interview with that completely manufactured, manual, and just say, yeah, this is how I would do it. It's really interesting, because that's a lot of work, but at the same time, it's really fun. It's a really cool thing to do, to just be able to, look at anything and say, I can figure out the best way to do that. It's not easy, but once you've got it, now there's this whole additional challenge, the workplace leadership of actually going out and convincing people to do their jobs that way. It's one thing to say, like, I'm the lab director, this is the SOP and you have to do it now. And of course, you can get away with that, but that doesn't make for productivity. It doesn't make for high morale, and it doesn't make for a harmonious workplace. That's where it becomes really more about style. It becomes more about how you identify probably with yourself, because that's the origin of how you're connecting with other people. And man, I mean, it's kind of like a lead by example type deal, but like, I gotta tell you, I go out to these places, we're looking at factories, we're thinking, this isn't a very good workflow, we're gonna get more equipment in here or make modifications, we can do all of our process design. And that's not even going on, 8 to 5 in the workplace. That's just what we do subconsciously, and we're trying to develop a strategy. When we're actually going into work, it's about developing that transition, being able to show how, let's say, for instance, we're doing one shift. Well, a lot of the factories I've worked at, we're going 24/7. That heavily impacted the way we did everything, the way we recorded things, the way that we would actually operate the equipment, the way we'd set it up and take it down. And in some cases, the actual parameters of those processes. When you look at all of the details, how all of those things come back to one basic issue of, when are people going to be in the factory and what are their teams going to look like, it becomes kind of obvious why you would need to have an engineering degree in order to get that kind of work done. but don't tell anybody else. And you gotta keep it to yourself, because that's not a humble position. Still, I have a lot of love for engineering and for people that are able to accomplish those challenges and then go out in the workforce, because there's probably nothing more difficult then the transition from sitting around, doing, differential equations, making your ODEs, figuring all of that work out, and then suddenly you're in a factory putting stickers on boxes. It's like, what did I do wrong? Like, what was the mistake? This is foolish. But the fact is that that's not true. If you had the ability to design control systems, you could get tired of doing it. I mean, really, going out to work has, it's like you do it for a livelihood, right? You do it so you can afford to live. But I mean, if you keep progressing through your career, then you're going to be more successful. You're going to bring in more money. You're going to be able to afford the lifestyle that you want. So in some ways, before you get to that point, it's really interesting to think about, what's the strategy? How am I going to become this, leader in the workplace, this professional that I want to be? Because, we look at these like job descriptions, they're always calling for like 5 years of this and 10 years of that and all these things. You think, I'm never going to get to that point. And if I had those qualifications, why would I want to leave the position where I developed them, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense. They're probably not offering enough money for it. And if they were, they'd do some kind of headhunting procedure to find out what it is. So what I do is I'm always looking at these job listings. I'm trying to think, what do production managers look like? What do operations consultants look like? What is it? And then constantly trying to become that, try to fill out that resume. I think there's nothing that's been better for my career than the fact that I spent a lot of time as a technician doing very mundane processes and just kind of finding peace with that, and finding a sense of harmony with all the other people that like are in there doing that work and are not as able to identify the inefficiencies within it. They get really defensive about the way they do their work. But I mean, if you can show them a better way, they're going to like it, but not going to want to hear it. So, it's an interesting challenge. It's led to a lot of really funny moments. Like I can remember at one point I was in Hawaii. I was setting up a dispensary, in a grow operation in Maui. And it was a lot of work. It was really tough because there's no one else there. And I'm having to like be in office all by myself. And I'm having to like be a factory all by myself. I'm having to like be like a garden all by myself. And like, it's tough. And I was still paying rent back in the city that I thought I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to fully move out here to Hawaii. So I'm getting bored. I'm doing room and board with a youth hostel just because it's like a free, exchange, and I'm the night manager. And all of a sudden I'm having more fun than I've ever had in my life just being the night manager at a youth hostel. And I'm like, wait, this isn't going to get me to where I'm trying to go. This isn't going to make me a better product manager, at least not for a long time. If I do it for a long time, it might be good in passing. And it's like sad because in some ways it's like now I've got, the happiness is right here in front of me. And, if I tried to explain to people back there about how there's this whole silly career that I'm just sort of inventing on the fly, they'd think, yeah, that's great. But, we're in Hawaii, just chill, man. And, but that's what it is. If you have a vision for who you can become, you've got to pursue that. And so here I'm talking about, cannabis extraction science. I'm talking about process design as it pertains to consultation, plant construction as it pertains to commissioning, and then ultimately operations management as it goes to workplace leadership. Because I'll tell you, at one point in time, I thought I didn't need that. I think I'm creative. I've spent some time going out, working in places, doing a bunch of different things, figuring out how factories, succeed or fail. I'm going to self-fund it. I had some entrepreneurial lawyers telling me that, there are ways you can convert credit to cash, for like 18 months, and you can try and run a whole venture before it all like falls in on you. And that's an interesting thing to do. If you're very certain that, you have a product people are going to buy, that's probably an intelligent thing to do. However, that's a really tough way to go through life, just, I don't need anyone, like I can do everything by myself. It's confusing because I think we all believe we can. That's how we got here. We know we can rely on ourselves, but to actually go like the full 9 yards with that and to develop something from scratch, I mean, Yeah, it's clear very few people ever accomplish that. And to really bring it back home, it's not the engineering degree that gives you that ability, but it's rather the motivation behind you that caused you to go get that degree. That means that you've got an ability to continue to learn and adapt and improve, very rapidly, probably more so than a lot of the other people's, if you're pursuing that vision that you had. So at this point, I want to take questions if you've got any, but if not, I've got more stuff I'll jump back into. Anything? That's okay. I gotta tell you, I've had like 3 jobs a year ever since I graduated from Long Beach, and that wasn't the plan. All right, yeah, I'm sorry if this hasn't been more organized or anything. It's crazy. Just a year ago, I had this factory out in Michigan. We had 200,000 square feet of greenhouse space, and everything was being converted. The problem was that it was from Michigan, and out in Michigan, we were having a problem with the water still being contaminated. So we were doing things like reverse osmosis, and we were doing a lot of other times water filtration. We were applying as much science as possible, but nonetheless, we were finding our plants had toxic levels of like copper and nickel, things that weren't even being tested for in the state, but were clearly a health hazard. It was a bit stupefying because with all the technology we were applying, there was no good reason for it to continue to show up, and we were looking for where in our system it could come from. However, with all that aside, we ended up with hundreds of thousands of pounds of this flower that couldn't go to market. Now, something that was interesting about that live resin hydrocarbon extraction is that because it had the capacity to, just to be discrete, only take the things that had the highest affinity for extraction, it turned out that it left behind those contaminants. It's interesting. That's kind of the holy grail in this particular science, is knowing how to remediate the effectively toxic components. That is a process which we go through a lot of trouble. When I was doing alcohol extraction back in Santa Ana, what we would do is we would take all of our extract once we had purged out the ethanol solvent, and then we would put it into a reactor vessel where we would begin to introduce things that could remove these components or catalyze them. And even that didn't work. We started getting into a process where we would take water and bring it down to a pH of 4, and then we would take our extracts and mix it with something like pentane because it forms a meniscus with water. Then we pour it in, stir it up, everything kind of breaks up. It's a process in pharmaceuticals called salting out, because all of these contaminants will precipitate. Then we come back and we would introduce an enzyme. There are particular enzymes we're able to pick based on where they actually cut up the proteins and the fats. But we were trying to get something that just cuts it off at the base because we just wanted them removed. So then we would drip that in, and we would effectively run a fermentation that would take maybe half an hour or longer. And it was really interesting because this process had the ability to remediate out, bad material. We would start running worse and worse stuff through it. Eventually, we were running things that seemed to have like human feces and other really strange things in it, and just freaking everybody out as we're packing a system. We're trying to think of what are good quality control measures, but we were actually able to clean it. And I'll tell you, these are the same techniques that are used in the food industry, used in other industries in order to purify these components. And being able to not simply recognize that that's used, but to be able to come up with a way to effectively assemble it, procure the equipment and then implement it, to an operation that's effectively, strapped for cash and it's sinking, is a difficult sell. But of course, if that's going to make the difference and increase the gains, it's a worthwhile one. Well, that's a whole lot of energy, right? Now, if we're doing this ultra premium extraction, we find out that it's able to leave behind those things without taking all that extra effort and leave us with a better product. I mean, that's incredible. That is so incredible. it's a big deal to know the difference in all these different processes, but it's miraculous if you can actually figure out when you don't need to know any of it and you can just get away by sort of silver bulleting through the whole thing. That kind of tacit experience is something you're only going to gather by roughing it out and trying to, solve the same problem so many different ways. So it's a funny example because it ties into what happened next. COVID hit and that factory shut down because we'd hired like a couple hundred people in a month or two. And then that was so much that there wasn't even like, we'll let some people go. So the whole thing was out. So then I was out in New York trying to put together a new facility together with the CBD industry during, the largest hemp harvest that we've ever had in recorded history. Now the CBD price has bottomed out to a point where it's like $400 a kilo. So coming down to Pennsylvania in what is a medical marijuana state where you can only be like a patient if you're going to buy things, we saw something really interesting where what was 20 cents in New York was selling for $40 in Pennsylvania. I mean, that's a 200-fold difference in value just for the same operation. It's kind of difficult to see why that would happen and where those types of price differentials exist in any industry and in any society. But by the time you have that perception of where the value is, combined with the fundamentals on how to create these processes and the workplace background to actually inspire your coworkers and your colleagues, that's the point where you're basically, you are the means to other people's success. And at that point, you just have to kind of survive. And it's the truth. I gotta tell you, and it might be different for you guys, but I have constantly tried to like earn like less than the people around me. And I'm telling you, like, it made me nervous a lot of times. I'm like, gosh, why don't I like try to negotiate for more? Why don't I try and go in there and get as much as possible? Because that's why we're here at work. But I'm telling you, these things that I'm applying, trying to build the lifestyle of carrying your whole team to success is something that everybody is going to need. And by the time that they recognize that you've got a track record for this, you become an indispensable team member wherever you go. And it's crazy to see that curve, but if you can sort of, the flight of Icarus, not too much, but not too little, that because if it's too little, you kind of undervalue everyone around you, but just stay right in the median. It just keeps coming back to you, and that's why it's like, 3 jobs a year, like that's way too much. That's like, why don't you have some more commitment? Why don't you stick with something? But the truth is, this is a startup industry. It's not an issue of cannabis. It's the fact that in any startup industry, there's lots of failure. And there's lots of teams that aren't able to cooperate. There's lots of investors that just have, cold feet. There's lots of, COVID hits. There's incredible reasons why things don't succeed. So ultimately, if you have that penchant for creativity, you can go into something like that and you can benefit even as the operation, the team itself is failing because you're able to improve from those experiences. You continue to earn your livelihood. You continue to have everything that makes for it. It's just, you have to have this ability to pivot and to see, what's around the corner. Probably the most incendiary thing I'd say here is that you should probably always be applying for work, always applying for new jobs. Not because you don't like the job you're at, but because that keeps your eye on what success looks like, what a better version of you doing your job looks like. And you kind of feel your way into it. It's like window browsing. And again, maybe that's too much. That's just kind of a waste of time. You just want to find one thing that works. But I'll tell you that trying to reinvent yourself over and over and over is ultimately what makes for a highly successful professional. And it's going to have no bearing on what that industry is. So even if it's cannabis, something that's basically illegal to do, you can succeed at being an engineer. Well, thank you.
I had a question.
Yes.
So on a day-to-day, you guys are just working to find new processes to improve the quality of the product? Or what do you guys do on a day-to-day?
essentially we have an operation, and so we're using all of our processes every single day. So it isn't about determining, what is the best way of doing things, but how do we transition towards something that's better? And having a strategy that, it isn't like this is wrong and that is right, but like these are little steps. Really the worst thing that can ever happen is you're progressing towards something and then you have to backtrack, because that'll confuse everybody else in the project. They won't see that we turned. They just see something that wasn't organized. That hurts your integrity as the project leader. So it's so important that the steps you make keep going in the same direction, especially when you've got a lot of other people involved. So to bring it back to your question, we have an operation, and it's making a product every day. And if we change what that product is, that affects every other department. Marketing might have to change something. The people in compliance are definitely going to have to respond to it. If we have a laboratory, they need to catch that. And if we don't, we have to go through the trouble of identifying that change. And that can all be very expensive. But if we change too much too quickly, then we will lose our cash flow. And that's what would kill business.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll tell you, additionally, that's where there's the second thing where I found myself like designing hydrocarbon extractors in my apartment just because it's like I don't want to use them, and I don't use them. I don't put solvent in them. There's no fuel. But when you can see that there's a different version of like what you've been trying to become that's now more in demand, it is pretty important that you're able to demonstrate that you also have those abilities. So essentially, by building these dangerous hydrocarbon extractors, I just sat around and I was able to say, oh yeah, I can see exactly what's not safe about it because I'm building it and that doesn't look safe. I don't feel comfortable with that. I'm putting things together and I was like, oh, they don't go together the way I thought they would go together. Well, it turns out that for someone who's got all these other skills, to also be doing that crazy thing completely sets me aside. Now I don't have any peers. And so things like that, they seem expensive, but then when you see like there's a sudden increase in pay because you made this sacrifice to do a project that really had no plan for return aside from that career development, it still pays off. Yeah. The truth is, after I graduated, even though I'd done cannabis extractions at Long Beach, I thought it was too soon for the industry. So I think I spent at least a year or two like doing contract labor work. So I was working like Hewlett Packard doing ink work, and then I was like in the sewers for a minute because I sort of jumped off. I wanted to get into computational genome sequencing, and then I sort of washed up to British Petroleum. And then we're doing like a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operation, and they got me in there on nights and weekends. And it's just like, what is this? I never think I would have wanted to work there, but by the time you're in the sewers, it looks like a pretty big step up. And so I would say, like, truthfully, I started getting full-time commercial work right around like 23, 24. So that's really not that long after graduation, but it felt like a lifetime. I really feel like I just became a completely different person due to the struggle of having all these different laboratories and occupational exposures and really oppressive leaderships that weren't going to allow for their contract laborers to transition into engineers and other things. That's just not how they think. And it's tough to try to make it in a place like that, but you can. And I saw many people who did. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We could wrap it there unless there's anything else you'd really like me to share. All right. I really would like to take any other questions anybody has in the future. You can always be you can email me. I think from the vice president here, it should be easy to get my email address, and I'll always be available. I find that a lot of work is kind of coming towards just the things I've described to you, and so for that reason, there's always kind of some little bit of action. If that's something people are interested in. I don't want to push it too hard, but I do want you to know it's available. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Actually, is it fine if I ask like one final question?
Uh-huh.
So Linda, you talked a lot about your experience and like I kind of want to thank you for like a lot of the like encouraging words that you shared with us today. So like, and then you also mentioned to like keep applying to stuff. So, but then like, I feel like I'm kind of like at this rut where like I've applied to like a lot of places and like I'm kind of like getting like discouraged here and there. Like, is there anything that's like helped you or that you feel like could help that could help us like keep moving forward, or, like trying new things or
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
like as a student?
I'll tell you, there really was a moment where I just decided like engineering didn't work for me. And it was before I gotten into doing cannabis and other things. It was really after doing all of these jobs as a contract labor, I started to feel like I wasn't even getting the attention from recruiters that I would need in order to sort of start an engineering career. And I thought I really messed up because like, what am I doing? I'm like hanging out in this place, just, you know, doing manual labor. I'm too exhausted to even study, you know, for exams and things. But really what it was is I got to I just sent it to one person because I'm not that good at messaging. So what it was is after BP I went to a place where we were doing pharmaceutical manufacturing, and we were making like these injectables. It was like a whole process, but I mean everybody was like, you know, no education or anything. They was just like, you know, we can do things, let's go do things. And I was really divided because on the one hand, it's like, technically, this was the best I could get. No one wanted me for anything else at that point. I'm just in here, you know, putting stickers on boxes in a clean room. But at the same time, I just kept doing it and understanding, you know, it's working for everybody else here. Like, I'm the only one that's got a problem with it, you know? And I started to realize I was just being way too hard on myself. You know, I was having way too much in the way of expectations, and that hurt because I didn't think I was asking for too much. I thought I was asking for like a little bit, and that wasn't even working out. And I'm like stuck at my parents' place, and you know, I can't even go out. You know, I can't meet people. I'm like kind of ashamed of what's going on over here. But really, that was when I started to work on myself. You know, I just realized all of this stuff was not what I needed. That's just how I felt. And so I tried to do something that was just really different. I went and enrolled. I was doing like traditional Chinese medicine through the Pacific College of Oriental Medicine, and I didn't finish it. But there were a group of people that were like really motivated and passionate to learn something that they felt was helping other people. And you know, that's the kind of positive energy that really makes life worth living. So I was kind of looking at that stuff and thinking about it, and that wasn't it either. And I'll tell you, because the story is going somewhere. There was this accident about 4 months into it. I just was like kind of tired, and I like ate a bunch of bagels and donuts, and I sort of like feeling bloated, and I just got a little lightheaded. But the SOP in this situation is called ambulance because I was working in this like clean room, in like the clean room. And so in a sense, you know, we don't know what's wrong with me. We need to do something about it. And because I was a contract laborer instead of an employee, I didn't really have the same healthcare coverage as the company thought I had. So they took me to a place that was outside of my service area. And that incident, which was really just, here's a glass of water, it cost me more money than I ever earned working that job for 4 months. And it was crazy. I mean, if you think about it, that's like a death sentence for a lot of people. You know, you can't suddenly have been going to a work camp for 4 months just because you wanted to learn about working. That's not any way to get through life. But that is literally what happened. And I mean, I'm just like really fucked up. And I'm like, I've just lost money coming in and like slaving away in here. But at that moment, it just finally clicked. It's like, these people aren't doing it because they don't like me. You know, they're doing it because it's the best way that they've been able to figure out to get their job done. You know, I'm saying this is actually in their mind the nicest thing that they could have done for me. And when they realized they were wrong about that, I mean, believe me, they felt like really badly about it. And that was when I started to feel like I was on the same team as them, really, is because we all understood that like something bad had happened here, even though we were doing what we thought we should be doing. And that was it. That's when I finally said, you know, this isn't about being an engineer. It's about understanding like the fundamentals of being in the workplace. and being able to tackle those issues the same way that we tackled them in engineering school. And at that point, I just, that was it. Now I'm building factories. And then I started getting into cannabis, and that was exactly what we did. We built an international CBD supply chain. And it was entirely by understanding these basic pieces of just being in a workplace and understanding how badly they could play out and how much they could hurt people, and understanding, what you've got to do is prevent that from ever happening to anyone. And now you're developing the leadership. So I know it's kind of a hard answer, but I'm telling you, in a way, there's no way you're going to get to the top without suffering something. So you've really got to try to understand how it connects to your future success, because ultimately what I'm able to do is get to that point of being that program director and developing a system that doesn't allow for that kind of trouble to befall anybody, and being able to explain how we're avoiding that. So kind of, you need to go out there and like have bad work experiences before you can have good work experiences, or you get a really good job. I mean, I'm not going to exclude that, but probably, if everything's too easy really early on, then you're not going to continue to improve. You're not going to understand what's important. That's a guess.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, in some ways it feels like it's always getting worse. I think I gotta tell you, the worst part of working in cannabis is that it's like illegal. I mean, I've had this issue of effectively stigmatizing myself, because at one point I realized, like, I have this resume that, like, no one reads that resume and says, oh, does he smoke weed? Like, no, it's really clear. And I've had it tell me, you got to think about that before you go into a career in cannabis, because it can be difficult to convince people that you have any professionalism if that's all they see. That's why at one point in time, I went back to CSULB and I took a class in human resources management, because I realized I had actually played myself. I had created the profile of someone that's not that professional. But I realized it's only two people that were taking a particular discipline in mind that I was creating that negative result. And so I went and I studied, human resources management in order to understand what was the little thing I was doing that was annoying everybody. And once I did, I more than solved the problem, because I was able to show, a way that you can do that job without having that silly, inconvenient aspect to it. And really, philosophizing about it and preaching that you can't just say anyone that's ever smoked weed isn't a professional. If you do that, you're not really trying that hard. And so I would say that about those human resources managers, that, if they can't figure out who the qualified candidates are and treat them well, then, maybe they aren't qualified to be in that role. But it's a lot. Yeah. Again, it's like, I'm not trying to say we don't need those people, because we do. They're the ones doing that job. But I'll tell you this: if you're going into, like, if you're talking to recruiters and you're like, oh yeah, I just took this little course in human resources management, they're instantly like, oh yeah, we connect, we do the same thing. And now, they're going to want to help you out more, just because it's little words, little cultural aspects that help you indicate that, you're what they should be looking for. So that's over in the College of Continuing Education. I highly encourage anyone to take that, because it's a pretty easy class. It's just about exposure. Yeah.
Does anybody else have questions for Philip? No. Well, thank you so much, Philip. If anybody didn't catch his email, he did put it in the chat, so I would definitely take a picture of those. But again, thank you so much. This information was very useful. We're all very thankful and grateful that you were able to come and speak to us. So thank you again.
Thank you. I do hope it helps, and if not, don't listen to me.
It brings like a sense of reality to a lot of us, because I feel like a lot of us feel like right after we graduate, we have to jump into something like professional and just start a career immediately. So this was very helpful to me, at least. So
I want you to know that I saw many of my classmates who looked very good on paper and who are very good, but who look even better on paper, immediately get roles after graduation doing like big scale process control, you know, for like millions of dollars per little thing. And it's so painful to see someone screw up a job like that because they're just new to the workforce. You know, I don't want to say you shouldn't rush into something like that, but it's hard to see that happen when, you know, like if you just kind of have some earlier experiences to make the mistakes and then get comfortable with yourself, those opportunities will still be there. Those better ones will still be there.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you. Hope everyone have a good day and don't get COVID.
Stay safe. Wear your mask.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.